For the first time since Edward's diagnosis, I smiled. Perhaps I wasn't as invisible as everyone believed. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and at 87 years old, I learnt that you can be erased from your own husband's funeral. Not physically, mind you. I was there, sitting in the third row of Magnolia Baptist Church on King Street, where Edward and I had worshipped for 43 years. But as I listened to my son Charles deliver a eulogy that painted our 65-year marriage as his father's solo journey, I realized I had become invisible in my own life. Edward Whitmore was a pillar of Charleston society. Charles announced from the pulpit, his voice carrying the authority he'd inherited from his father's law practice. He built Whitmore and Associates from nothing, served on the historic Charleston Foundation board, and raised a family that continues his legacy of service. Raised a family, as if Edward had been a single father, as if I hadn't been the one managing household finances while he established his practice, as if I hadn't given up my tenure-track position at the College of Charleston to support his career, as if I hadn't been the one who actually raised Charles while Edward worked 16-hour days building that practice. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations of family friends who'd known us for decades. "Poor Eleanor," someone murmured. "At least she has Charles to take care of her now. Take care of me." Like I was a burden to be managed, rather than the woman who'd managed Edward's household, his social calendar, and his business entertaining for decades. My daughter-in-law Stephanie had orchestrated every detail of this funeral with the precision of a military campaign. She'd chosen the flowers, selected the music, even written the obituary that somehow managed to mention Edward's golf handicap, but forgot to include my maiden name, or the fact that I'd been Charleston's first female literature professor to receive tenure. In Stephanie's version of our family history, I was simply beloved wife and mother, a footnote to Edward's accomplishments. The receiving line after the service was the cruelest part. Old friends approached with their condolences, but their eyes kept drifting to Charles and Stephanie, as if they were the primary mourners. "How is Eleanor holding up?" They'd ask Charles, speaking about me as if I weren't standing right there. When they did address me directly, it was with the careful, overly loud voice people use with the elderly and confused. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd been in my book club for 15 years, patted my hand and said, "Don't you worry about anything, dear. I'm sure Charles and Stephanie will take good care of you. Take care of me." There it was again, that phrase that had begun to define my existence since Edward's Alzheimer's diagnosis 3 years ago. The final humiliation came when everyone began leaving for the cemetery. I stood by the church doors, assuming someone would offer me a ride in the family car. Instead, I watched as Charles, Stephanie and their children climbed into the black limousine while I remained on the sidewalk. Mum, Charles called through the window, "We'll see you at the cemetery." There wasn't room for everyone. Not room for everyone. Not room for Edward's wife of 65 years. I walked home in my black dress and sensible shoes, the October rain soaking through my coat. The house on Trad Street that Edward and I had shared for 4 decades felt different when I unlocked the front door. Larger somehow, but also smaller. The silence had a quality I'd never noticed before, not peaceful, but hollow, like a held breath. In the front hall, I hung up Edward's coat, the one he'd worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. As I smoothed the fabric, my fingers found something crinkled in the inner pocket. A small piece of paper with handwriting I didn't recognize. "E.W., the Tamarind Trust papers, are in the safe deposit box. Key is where you left it. J.D. and J.D. The Tamarind Trust." I hadn't thought about that name in decades. It was something my father had mentioned years ago before his death, but Edward had always handled our financial affairs. I'd assumed it was one of those old Charleston family trusts that had been dissolved generations ago. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, each step heavier than the last. The house creaked around me, settling into its emptiness. Tomorrow, I knew, Charles and Stephanie would begin the process of helping me manage my affairs. They'd already made hints about assisted living, about the burden of maintaining such a large house, about the importance of simplifying my life. But tonight, as I sat on the edge of the bed Edward and I had shared for so many years, I found myself thinking about that note, about the Tamarind Trust, and a key hidden somewhere in this house, about the possibility that there might be more to my life than being someone's beloved wife and mother. I reached for Edward's coat again, running my hands along the silk lining. There, in a seam I'd never noticed, my fingers found a small hard object. A key, tarnished with age, attached to a tag that read Tamarind Trust, First Citizens Bank, Meeting Street. For the first time since Edward's diagnosis, I smiled. Perhaps I wasn't as invisible as everyone believed. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and at 87 years old, I learnt that you can be erased from your own husband's funeral. Not physically, mind you. I was there, sitting in the third row of Magnolia Baptist Church on King Street, where Edward and I had worshipped for 43 years. But as I listened to my son Charles deliver a eulogy that painted our 65-year marriage as his father's solo journey, I realized I had become invisible in my own life. Edward Whitmore was a pillar of Charleston society. Charles announced from the pulpit, his voice carrying the authority he'd inherited from his father's law practice. He built Whitmore and Associates from nothing, served on the historic Charleston Foundation board, and raised a family that continues his legacy of service. Raised a family, as if Edward had been a single father, as if I hadn't been the one managing household finances while he established his practice, as if I hadn't given up my tenure-track position at the College of Charleston to support his career, as if I hadn't been the one who actually raised Charles while Edward worked 16-hour days building that practice. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations of family friends who'd known us for decades. "Poor Eleanor," someone murmured. "At least she has Charles to take care of her now. Take care of me." Like I was a burden to be managed, rather than the woman who'd managed Edward's household, his social calendar, and his business entertaining for decades. My daughter-in-law Stephanie had orchestrated every detail of this funeral with the precision of a military campaign. She'd chosen the flowers, selected the music, even written the obituary that somehow managed to mention Edward's golf handicap, but forgot to include my maiden name or the fact that I'd been Charleston's first female literature professor to receive tenure. In Stephanie's version of our family history, I was simply beloved wife and mother, a footnote to Edward's accomplishments. The receiving line after the service was the cruelest part. Old friends approached with their condolences, but their eyes kept drifting to Charles and Stephanie, as if they were the primary mourners. "How is Eleanor holding up?" They'd ask Charles, speaking about me as if I weren't standing right there. When they did address me directly, it was with the careful, overly loud voice people use with the elderly and confused. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd been in my book club for 15 years, patted my hand and said, "Don't you worry about anything, dear. I'm sure Charles and Stephanie will take good care of you. Take care of me." There it was again, that phrase that had begun to define my existence since Edward's Alzheimer's diagnosis 3 years ago. The final humiliation came when everyone began leaving for the cemetery. I stood by the church doors, assuming someone would offer me a ride in the family car. Instead, I watched as Charles, Stephanie, and their children climbed into the black limousine while I remained on the sidewalk. "Mum," Charles called through the window. "We'll see you at the cemetery." There wasn't room for everyone. Not room for everyone. Not room for Edward's wife of 65 years. I walked home in my black dress and sensible shoes, the October rain soaking through my coat. The house on Trad Street, that Edward and I had shared for 4 decades, felt different when I unlocked the front door. Larger somehow, but also smaller. The silence had a quality I'd never noticed before, not peaceful but hollow, like a held breath. In the front hall, I hung up Edward's coat, the one he'd worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. As I smoothed the fabric, my fingers found something crinkled in the inner pocket. A small piece of paper with handwriting I didn't recognize. "The Tamarind Trust papers are in the safe deposit box. Key is where you left it. J.D. The Tamarind Trust." I hadn't thought about that name in decades. It was something my father had mentioned years ago, before his death. But Edward had always handled our financial affairs. I'd assumed it was one of those old Charleston family trusts that had been dissolved generations ago. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, each step heavier than the last. The house creaked around me, settling into its emptiness. Tomorrow, I knew, Charles and Stephanie would begin the process of helping me manage my affairs. They'd already made hints about assisted living, about the burden of maintaining such a large house, about the importance of simplifying my life. But tonight, as I sat on the edge of the bed Edward and I had shared for so many years, I found myself thinking about that note, about the Tamarind Trust, and a key hidden somewhere in this house, about the possibility that there might be more to my life than being someone's beloved wife and mother. I reached for Edward's coat again, running my hands along the silk lining. There, in a seam I'd never noticed, my fingers found a small, hard object, a key tarnished with age, attached to a tag that read Tamarind Trust, First Citizens Bank, Meeting Street. For the first time since Edward's diagnosis, I smiled. Perhaps I wasn't as invisible as everyone. The morning after Edward's funeral, I woke to the sound of Stephanie's voice in my kitchen, not knocking, not calling ahead, just there, as if she owned the place, which I was beginning to understand. She believed she did. "Eleanor, we need to talk," she said. When I appeared in my robe, the Tamarind Trust key still clutched in my palm from the night before. "Charles is concerned about you living alone in this big house. We've been looking at some lovely assisted living communities." I poured myself coffee from the pot she'd made without asking, studying her face in the morning light. Stephanie was 43, the same age I'd been when I gave up my chance at department chair to support Edward's political ambitions. She was attractive in that Charleston society way, blonde highlights, tennis tan, clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about her was calculated, from her volunteer work at the right charities to her membership in the right clubs. "I'm not ready to discuss living arrangements," I said quietly. "Edward's been gone exactly 12 hours. But Eleanor, you have to be practical. This house is far too much for you to manage alone, and frankly, we're worried about your memory. Yesterday you seemed so confused during the service." Confused. That was Stephanie's favorite word for me lately. Any time I disagreed with her decisions or questioned her choices, I was confused. When I'd asked why I wasn't included in the funeral planning, I was confused. When I'd wondered why my sister hadn't been invited to the reception, I was confused. When I'd noticed that family photos were being rearranged to minimize my presence, I was confused. "I wasn't confused," I said, sitting at the kitchen table that had been mine for 40 years. I was surprised to discover I'd been erased from my own husband's eulogy. Stephanie's smile tightened. "Oh, Eleanor, Charles was trying to keep things brief. Everyone knows how much Edward loved you. It didn't need to be said. It didn't need to be said, as if 65 years of marriage could be reduced to something so obvious it wasn't worth mentioning. As if my role in Edward's life had been so inconsequential that it could be taken for granted." After she left, I sat in Edward's study, surrounded by the law books and case files that had consumed so much of our life together. On his desk was a framed photo of us from our wedding day, young, hopeful, believing we'd face the world as partners. I picked it up, studying my 22-year-old face, remembering the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from Converse College with plans to revolutionize Southern literature studies. That woman had published 3 papers on Flannery O'Connor before she turned 30. She'd been offered positions at Duke and Emory. She'd had opinions about everything from civil rights to women's suffrage, and she'd never been afraid to voice them. When had I stopped being that woman? When had I become someone who needed to be taken care of? The answer came in pieces, like a puzzle assembling itself. It started with Edward's first campaign for city council, when his advisors suggested that an outspoken academic wife might hurt his chances. "Just tone it down a little," he'd said, "for the good of the family, so I'd learn to smile instead of debate, to nod instead of challenge, to be seen and not heard." Then came Charles's childhood, when Edward's increasing success meant longer hours and more travel. "You're so much better with him than I am," Edward would say, leaving me to handle parent-teacher conferences, soccer practices, and teenage rebellion while he built his reputation as one of Charleston's most prominent attorneys. The final erasure had come with Edward's Alzheimer's diagnosis. Suddenly, I wasn't Eleanor Whitmore, retired professor and community volunteer. I was Edward's caregiver, his handler, his keeper. Charles and Stephanie had quietly taken over our finances, our social calendar, our medical decisions. "To help you focus on Dad," they'd explained. "To reduce your stress." I'd been grateful for their help. I'd been so overwhelmed by watching my brilliant husband disappear piece by piece that I'd handed over control of everything else without question. I'd signed papers I didn't read, agreed to changes. I didn't understand, and gradually been reduced to a supporting character in my own life. But now, with the Tamarind Trust key in my hand, I was beginning to remember who I'd been before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. I was beginning to remember Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who'd once terrified graduate students with her sharp wit and sharper intellect. I called the number I'd memorized 60 years ago, the one my father had made me promise to remember. James Dalrymple Saren had been my family's attorney since I was a child. His son James Jr. had taken over the practice decades ago, but the number remained the same. Mrs. Whitmore, James Jr. S voice was warm with genuine sympathy. I was so sorry to hear about Edward. He was a good man and a worthy opponent in court. Thank you, James. I'm calling about something my father set up years ago, the Tamarind Trust. I found a key. There was a long pause. Mrs. Whitmore, are you somewhere you can speak privately? The question sent a chill through me. Yes, I'm alone. Good. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning? Early, before the staff arrives, and Eleanor, don't mention this conversation to anyone. Not yet. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness, understanding for the first time that my invisibility might have been a gift. While everyone had been watching Edward, while Charles and Stephanie had been cataloguing his assets and making their plans, no one had been paying attention to me. No one had thought to wonder what Eleanor Whitmore might have been hiding in the shadows of James Dalrymple Jr. S office on Broad Street. Looked exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. Mahogany paneling, Persian rugs, and the smell of leather and old paper that spoke of Charleston's legal aristocracy. But the man who greeted me at 7:30 the next morning was not the imposing figure I'd known as a child. James was my age now, silver-haired and careful in his movements, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made his father legendary in Charleston legal circles. Eleanor, he said, embracing me with the familiarity of someone who'd known me since I was in pigtails. I'm glad you called. I've been waiting for this conversation for over 30 years. We walked to his private office, where he poured coffee from a silver service that had probably been in his family for generations. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment I felt transported back to my childhood, when my father would bring me here for meetings I was too young to understand. Before we begin, James said, settling behind his desk, I need to know how much you remember about your father's financial arrangements. I thought back to those long-ago conversations, fragments of memory that had seemed unimportant at the time. He mentioned the Tamarind Trust occasionally, something about protecting the family assets. But Edward handled all our financial matters after we married, and I assumed it had been dissolved. James smiled, an expression that held both sadness and satisfaction. Your father was a remarkably forward-thinking man, Eleanor. He understood that in Charleston society, women could be overlooked when it came to matters of inheritance and property. He wanted to ensure that you would never be dependent on anyone else's goodwill. He opened a thick folder that bore my father's name in faded ink. The Tamarind Trust was established in 1952, shortly after your mother's death. Your father was concerned about what would happen to you if he died while you were young, or if you ever found yourself in a position where you needed resources that weren't subject to a husband's control. The words hit me like a physical blow. My father had seen this coming, had anticipated that I might one day be reduced to someone's dependent, someone's burden. He'd planned for this moment when I was barely 20 years old. The trust was funded with your father's shipping profits, James continued. He was quite successful in the years following the war, and he invested wisely. The original trust document specified that the assets would remain untouched until you either turned 70 or found yourself in circumstances where you needed independent financial resources. I stared at the papers he was spreading across his desk, deeds, stock certificates, bank statements, all bearing my name as the sole trustee. How much are we talking about, James? He looked at me over his glasses, and I could see my father's expression in his eyes, the same mixture of pride and protectiveness that had defined my childhood. As of yesterday's market close, the Tamarind Trust holds assets worth approximately $50 million. The number hung in the air between us like a revelation. $50 million. While I'd been accepting condolences and allowing my family to make plans for my future, I'd been sitting on a fortune that would have made Edward's estate look modest by comparison. Your father was very specific about the conditions, James said, pulling out a letter written in my father's familiar handwriting. The trust was designed to protect you from exactly the kind of situation you've found yourself in. He wrote, Eleanor has the finest mind of any woman I've ever known. She should never have to depend on anyone else's generosity or suffer anyone else's condescension. I felt tears stinging my eyes. My father had known me better than I'd known myself. He'd seen the woman I could become and the woman I might be reduced to, and he'd planned accordingly. The assets are completely liquid, James continued. Your father established accounts at 3 different banks, invested in blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds, and acquired several properties around Charleston. The house on Trad Street that you and Edward shared. That was purchased through the trust. It's been yours all along. My house, the home where I'd raised my son, where I'd entertained Edward's colleagues, where I'd been planning to spend my remaining years as a guest dependent on my family's goodwill, it had been mine the entire time. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I asked. Why wait until now? James leaned forward, his expression serious. Because your father was very clear about the conditions. The trust was only to be activated if you asked about it specifically, or if I determined that you were in a position where you needed protection from family members who might not have your best interests at heart. The implication was clear. James had been watching my situation with Charles and Stephanie, had seen the slow erosion of my independence, and had been waiting for the right moment to reveal my father's gift. There's one more thing, he said, handing me a sealed envelope. Your father left this for you, to be opened only when you learned about the trust. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper in my father's handwriting. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then you have found yourself in need of the independence I always knew you deserved. Money is not everything, but it is freedom. Use it wisely, use it well, and never let anyone make you feel small again. You are a tamarind, and tamarinds do not bow to anyone. All my love, Papa. I sat in James's office for a long time, holding that letter and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Not the kind of power that comes from manipulation or control, but the kind that comes from knowing you have choices. When I finally left James's office, I wasn't the same woman who'd entered. I was Eleanor Tamarind Whitmore, and I had 50 million reasons to reclaim. The first thing I did with my newfound freedom was hire back Lydia Brennan, my former research assistant from my teaching days. At 62, Lydia had been forced into early retirement when the college restructured, but she'd lost none of her sharp efficiency or her ability to organize complex information. More importantly, she'd known me before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. Professor Whitmore, she said when I called her that afternoon, using the title I hadn't heard in years. I was so sorry to hear about Edward. How are you holding up? For the first time in recent memory, someone was asking how I was, not how I was being managed. I'm discovering that I'm stronger than anyone realized. Lydia, I have a proposition for you. We met the next day at my house on Trad Street. My house as I now knew it to be. Lydia arrived with her laptop and the same intensity she'd brought to organizing my academic research 30 years ago. I explained about the Tamarind Trust, about the $50 million that no one in my family knew existed, and about my growing understanding of how systematically I'd been marginalized. What do you want to do with this information? Lydia asked, her fingers already flying over her keyboard as she took notes. I want to reclaim my life, I said, but I want to do it strategically. I want to help people who've been overlooked the way I was, and I want to make sure that my family understands the difference between being loved and being useful. Lydia smiled, and I remembered why I'd always valued her assistance. She understood the subtleties of power, the difference between revenge and justice. Where do we start? We started with my banking arrangements. Charles and Stephanie had gradually taken over Edward's accounts, adding their names as co-signers in case of emergency. They'd simplified our financial life. They'd explained, consolidating everything into accounts they could monitor and manage. What they didn't know was that Edward's accounts had never contained my personal assets, because I'd never had any personal assets to begin with. Now I did. James Dalrymple had already begun the process of activating the trust accounts, and within a week I had access to resources that would have made Charles's law practice look like a corner store. I opened new accounts in my name only, transferred the household expenses to my personal funds, and quietly began paying for services that Charles and Stephanie had assumed they were providing out of generosity. The cleaning lady who came twice a week. I'd been paying her salary all along, through the trust, though Charles had been taking credit for helping with household expenses. The lawn service that maintained the gardens Edward had been so proud of. Also mine. Even the grocery delivery service that Stephanie had arranged to make things easier for me was being funded by my own resources. I realized, already paying for my own life. My family had simply been taking credit for it. The second step was more complex. I wanted to understand exactly how I'd been written out of my own narrative, so I asked Lydia to help me trace the evolution of my disappearance. We went through family photos, social media posts, Christmas cards, and community newsletters, documenting how my role had been gradually diminished over the years. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. In early photos, I was positioned as Edward's equal partner, standing beside him at ribbon cuttings, quoted in newspaper articles about his political activities, credited as co-host of the social events that had been crucial to his career. But gradually, I'd been moved to the margins. Edward and Charles became the focus, with me relegated to the background. My quotes disappeared from articles. My name was dropped from event invitations. I became Edward's wife rather than Eleanor Whitmore. The most telling discovery came when Lydia pulled the membership records for the Charleston Historical Society, where I'd served on the board for 15 years. My name had been quietly removed from the active membership list 3 years ago, when Edward's Alzheimer's diagnosis became public. The official reason was family circumstances, but I'd never been consulted about the decision. I'd been erased from my own community involvement without even realizing it. While Lydia organized this documentation, I began my own quiet campaign of reclamation. I contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, the current chair of the Charleston Historical Society, and asked about rejoining the board. I reached out to former colleagues at the college, letting them know I was interested in returning to guest lecturing. I made appointments with directors of local charities where I'd once volunteered. The responses were illuminating. Most people were delighted to hear from me, surprised that I'd been absent from activities they'd assumed I'd simply outgrown. Several mentioned that they'd been told I was too overwhelmed with family responsibilities to continue my community involvement. Some had been specifically informed that I was not up to the demands of board service or volunteer work. Charles and Stephanie, it seemed, had been systematically removing me from my own life, using my role as Edward's caregiver as an excuse to isolate me from my independence. But the most revealing conversation came when I called Catherine Morrison, who'd been my closest friend during our children's school years. We'd gradually drifted apart over the past decade, and I'd assumed it was the natural result of changing circumstances. "Eleanor," she said, her voice warm but careful, "I've been thinking about you so much since I heard about Edward. I wanted to reach out, but Charles told me you were having a difficult time and preferred not to be disturbed." Charles had been intercepting my social connections, filtering my relationships through his own judgment about what was appropriate for me. He'd been making decisions about my friendships, my activities, my entire social world. That evening, I sat in Edward's study with a legal pad, writing down everything I'd learned. The pattern was clear. I'd been subjected to a systematic campaign of isolation, designed to make me dependent on my family's goodwill. It was subtle, gradual, and devastatingly effective. But it was also reversible. With $50 million and a clear understanding of what had been done to me, I could begin to undo the damage. I could reclaim not just my financial independence, but my identity, my relationships, and my place in the world. The only question was how much my family would resist when they realized their dependent was about to become their. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Charles and Stephanie arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning, their faces wearing identical expressions of practiced concern. They'd brought papers, a thick folder of documents that they spread across my dining room table, with the efficiency of people who'd been planning this moment for months. "Mum," Charles said, his voice taking on the tone he'd once used to explain why he couldn't eat his vegetables. "We need to talk about your future. Stephanie and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to make some changes." I poured myself coffee from the pot, Lydia had made earlier, noting how my son's eyes swept the room as if cataloguing assets. What kind of changes, Charles? Stephanie leaned forward, her smile bright and hollow. We found a lovely assisted living community in Mount Pleasant. Magnolia Gardens. It's very exclusive, very well appointed. You'd have your own apartment, but there would be staff available around the clock. And Charles added, pulling out a legal document, we've prepared a power of attorney arrangement that would allow us to manage your finances and medical decisions. It's really the most sensible solution for everyone involved. I studied the papers they'd prepared, recognizing the careful language that would strip away every vestige of my independence. The power of attorney was comprehensive. They would control my bank accounts, my medical care, my living arrangements, even my ability to make gifts or donations. I would become a ward of my own family. This is very thorough, I said, setting the documents aside. Tell me, Charles, what prompted this sudden concern for my welfare? He exchanged a glance with Stephanie, and I saw the moment they decided to abandon subtlety. Mum, you haven't been yourself since Dad died. You've been confused, forgetful. Yesterday you missed your appointment with Dr. Patterson, and when I called to check on you, you were completely disoriented. I hadn't missed any appointment with Dr. Patterson. I'd never had an appointment with Dr. Patterson, but I understood what was happening. They were creating a narrative of incompetence that would justify their control. I see, I said quietly. And you've been documenting these episodes of confusion. Stephanie nodded eagerly. We've been keeping careful records. The missed appointments, the times you've called us repeatedly about the same issue, the way you've been withdrawing from your normal activities. We're worried about you, Eleanor. We think you might be developing the same condition that affected Edward. The cruelty of it took my breath away. They were using Edward's Alzheimer's diagnosis as a weapon against me, suggesting that my grief and their systematic isolation were actually signs of cognitive decline. It was brilliant in its manipulative efficiency. I appreciate your concern, I said, reaching for my phone. Oh, we already have, Charles said, producing another document. Dr. Harrison from the Geriatric Psychiatry Department at MUSC has reviewed your case. Based on our reports of your behavior, he's recommended immediate evaluation for cognitive impairment. Dr. Harrison, a doctor who'd never met me, never examined me, never spoken to me, but who'd been willing to recommend psychiatric evaluation based on my family's second-hand reports. I wondered how much Charles had paid for that professional opinion. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Edward and I had planned to spend our retirement years. For a moment I allowed myself to imagine what would have happened if I'd never found the Tamarind Trust key. I would have signed those papers, grateful for my family's care, and disappeared into the institutional anonymity they'd planned for me. Instead, I turned back to face them, and for the first time in years, I let them see the woman I'd been before I became someone's wife and mother. Charles, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd once used to silence unruly graduate students. I want you to listen very carefully. I am not confused. I am not forgetful. I am not developing Alzheimer's disease. I am grieving the loss of my husband, and I am angry about the way I've been treated by my own family. Stephanie started to speak, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. I know about the times you've told my friends I was too fragile to maintain our friendships. I know about the board positions you've quietly arranged for me to lose. I know about the way you've been positioning yourselves as my caretakers while systematically removing me from my own life. Charles's face was reddening, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. Mum, you're proving our point. This paranoid thinking, these accusations, are completely accurate, I interrupted, and documented. My research assistant has been very thorough in tracing the pattern of my disappearance from my own life. The mention of Lydia clearly surprised them. Stephanie's composure cracked slightly. Research assistant. Eleanor, you don't have a research assistant. You're retired. I'm retired from teaching, I said. I'm not retired from thinking or from making my own decisions about my life and my resources. The word resources hung in the air like a challenge. I could see both of them trying to process what I might mean, what I might know about assets they'd assumed they were inheriting. What resources? Charles asked, and I heard the first note of uncertainty in his voice. I smiled, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. That's an interesting question. Charles, why don't you tell me what you think I'm worth? The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear their mental calculations, their assumptions about Edward's estate, their plans for my future that had never included consulting me about my own wishes. Finally, Charles cleared his throat. "Yes, Mom, I think we should table this discussion until you've had time to calm down. You're obviously upset, and we don't want to make any decisions while you're emotional." "You're absolutely right," I said, gathering up their power of attorney documents. "I am emotional. I'm angry. I'm disappointed, and I'm done being managed. I think you should leave now." As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Stephanie turned back with one final attempt at manipulation. "Eleanor, we're only trying to help you. We love you and we're worried about you." I looked at this woman who'd married my son and systematically erased me from my own family's story. "No, Stephanie, you're not trying to help me. You're trying to control me. There's a difference." After they left, I sat in my dining room, shaking not from fear, but from the exhilaration of finally speaking my truth. For the first time in years, I'd refused to be diminished, refused to be managed, refused to accept someone else's version of my reality. It was time to show them exactly what they'd been trying. The Charleston Post and Courier's Society page had always been important to families like mine, and families like the one Charles had married into. So when I contacted my old friend Rebecca Hartwell, now the paper's lifestyle editor, about making a significant philanthropic announcement, I knew word would reach the right people quickly. "Eleanor Whitmore," Rebecca said, when she arrived at my house for the interview. "I haven't seen you in ages. I was so sorry to hear about Edward." We sat in my living room, where Lydia had arranged displays of my father's shipping memorabilia and my own academic achievements, the books I'd published, the awards I'd received, the recognition I'd earned before I'd been reduced to someone's wife and mother. Rebecca's photographer captured images of me surrounded by the evidence of my own accomplishments. "I'm announcing the establishment of the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation," I told her, enjoying the way her eyes widened at the mention of the Tamarind name. Every old Charleston family knew the Tamarind shipping fortune, though most had assumed it had been spent decades ago. "The foundation will focus on supporting older women who've been overlooked or marginalized, particularly those who've given up careers to support their families." Rebecca's pen moved quickly across her notepad. "This is wonderful, Eleanor. What's the scope of the foundation's resources?" I smiled, remembering the moment James Dalrymple had told me about my inheritance. "The initial endowment will be $12 million. The number hung in the air like a revelation. Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. $12 million. "Eleanor, I had no idea you had access to those kinds of resources." "Most people didn't," I said. "I've been what you might call a silent partner in my own life for many years. But silence can be overrated." The article ran on the front page of the lifestyle section 3 days later, complete with photos of me in my library, surrounded by my father's business records and my own academic achievements. The headline read, "Charleston's Quiet Philanthropist. Eleanor Whitmore establishes foundation to support overlooked women." The story painted a picture of a woman who'd been quietly managing significant resources while supporting her husband's career and raising her family. It mentioned my academic background, my father's business success, and my decision to step back into public life following Edward's death. What it didn't mention was how surprised my own family had been to learn about my foundation. Charles called within an hour of the paper's publication. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Where did you get $12 million? I was in my garden deadheading roses and enjoying the October sunshine. "Good morning, Charles. I'm well, thank you for asking." "Don't play games with me. That article makes it sound like you've been sitting on a fortune this whole time. Dad never mentioned anything about that kind of money." "Your father didn't know about the Tamarind Trust," I said. "It was established by my father specifically to ensure my independence. I'm sure you can appreciate the wisdom of that arrangement." The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. I could practically hear Charles recalculating everything he'd assumed about my financial situation, about his inheritance, about his family's future. "We need to talk," he said finally. "I agree, but this time, Charles, we'll talk on my terms." The second wave of attention came from the Charleston Historical Society, which had quietly removed me from their membership rolls 3 years earlier. Dr. Sarah Chen called that afternoon, her voice bright with embarrassment. "Eleanor, I had no idea you were interested in returning to active involvement with the society. When I read about your foundation in the paper, I realized we may have made an error in understanding your circumstances." An error in understanding my circumstances. Diplomatic language for the assumption that I'd become irrelevant to Charleston's cultural life. "I'd be very interested in discussing my involvement with the society," I said, "particularly regarding the preservation of women's contributions to Charleston's history. It's an area that's been somewhat overlooked." By the end of the week, I'd received calls from 3 different non-profit boards, 2 museum directors, and the dean of the College of Charleston's English department. My $12 million foundation had transformed me from a grieving widow into a philanthropic force worth courting. But the most satisfying response came from an unexpected source. Margaret Pemberton, my former book club member, who'd patted my hand at Edward's funeral and assured me that Charles would take care of me, called to congratulate me on the foundation announcement. "Eleanor, I feel terrible that I didn't realize you were managing such significant resources. I'm so impressed by what you're doing with the foundation. Would you be interested in rejoining our book club? We've missed your insights." My insights. The same insights that had been dismissed as confusion and forgetfulness when I'd tried to contribute to family discussions about my own future. "I'd love to rejoin," I said. "In fact, I'd like to suggest our next selection, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. I think it's particularly relevant to discussions about women's independence." The message was subtle but unmistakable. I was reclaiming my intellectual identity, my social connections, and my place in Charleston's cultural community. I was no longer someone's dependent. I was someone worth knowing. That evening, as I sat in my study reviewing foundation applications, I reflected on the power of public recognition. For years, I'd been invisible because I'd allowed myself to be invisible. I'd accepted other people's definitions of my worth, their assessments of my capabilities, their decisions about my relevance. But money, I was learning, was a powerful antidote to invisibility. $12 million had transformed me from a burden into a benefactor, from a problem into a solution, from someone who needed help into someone who could provide it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd always had this money, this power, this independence. I'd simply been too willing to let others define my limitations. But no more. Charleston was about to rediscover Eleanor Whitmore, and my family was about to learn the difference between being loved and... I scheduled the will reading for a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 month after Edward's funeral. The venue was deliberately chosen, not James Dalrymple's office, which would have felt too formal, but the library of the historic Nathaniel Russell House, where I'd volunteered as a docent for 15 years, before Charles and Stephanie had quietly arranged for my retirement from public activities. The guest list was carefully curated. Charles and Stephanie, of course, along with their children, my grandchildren Sarah and Michael, now 23 and 21 respectively. My sister Ruth, who'd driven up from Savannah specifically for the reading. James Dalrymple Jr., representing the legal formalities, and Lydia, who'd been documenting every detail of my family's reaction to my newfound visibility. I arrived early, arranging myself in the wing-back chair that had been my favorite during board meetings. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the reckoning about to unfold. Charles and Stephanie arrived precisely on time, their faces wearing identical expressions of barely concealed anxiety. The newspaper article about my foundation had shaken them, but they'd clearly convinced themselves that $12 million was the extent of my resources. They were prepared for a moderately wealthy mother-in-law, not the heiress to a shipping fortune. My grandchildren entered more hesitantly. Sarah, recently graduated from Wofford College, had always been the more thoughtful of the two, often asking questions about my life before I'd become their grandmother. Michael, still finishing his business degree at Clemson, had inherited his father's practical nature, but lacked Charles's calculating edge. Ruth arrived last, embracing me with the warmth of someone who'd known me since childhood. At 84, she was one of the few people who remembered me as Eleanor Tamarind, the shipping magnate's daughter who'd been expected to marry well and live quietly. She'd been the only family member who'd questioned my gradual disappearance from public life, though she'd attributed it to the demands of caring for Edward. "Well," James said, settling his glasses on his nose and opening his leather portfolio. We're here to discuss the distribution of Eleanor's estate, as outlined in her recently updated will. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Recently updated. Yes, I said, enjoying the moment of revelation. I made some changes after Edward's funeral. Recent events helped clarify my priorities. James cleared his throat and began reading from the formal document. Eleanor Tamarind Whitmore, being of sound mind and clear judgment, do hereby distribute my assets as follows. The first bequests were traditional, small amounts to long-time employees, donations to charities. Edward and I had supported, gifts to the church where we'd worshipped. Charles's breathing grew more relaxed as these familiar elements unfolded. Then came the surprise. To my sister Ruth Tamarind Morrison, who has been a constant source of support and wisdom throughout my life, I leave the sum of $2 million and my collection of family photographs, letters and memorabilia. Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Eleanor, I had no idea you had access to such resources. Charles's mouth fell open. $2 million? Mum, what's going on here? James continued reading. To my granddaughter Sarah Whitmore, who has always shown genuine interest in my life and experiences, I leave the sum of $5 million to be held in trust until she reaches the age of 25, along with my complete academic library and personal papers. Sarah began crying quietly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. Grandma, I don't understand. How do you have this much money? To my grandson Michael Whitmore, I leave the sum of $1 million to be held in trust until he completes his education and demonstrates financial responsibility through 2 years of independent employment. Michael stared at me in shock. Grandma, this is incredible. I mean, thank you. But I don't understand how. Let James finish, I said gently. Then I'll explain everything. James's voice grew more formal as he reached the heart of the document. To my daughter-in-law Stephanie Whitmore, I leave my crystal stemware collection and my best wishes for her future endeavors. The crystal stemware, wedding gifts from 65 years ago, valuable primarily as antiques, but hardly a significant inheritance. Stephanie's face went white as she realized what the bequest meant. And to my son Charles Whitmore, James continued, I leave the sum of $50,000 and a letter explaining my decisions regarding his inheritance. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles stared at James as if he'd misheard, as if the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something more acceptable. $50,000? Charles's voice was barely a whisper. That's it? James handed him an envelope bearing my handwriting. Your mother requested that you read this letter privately. The remainder of Mrs. Whitmore's estate, approximately $40 million, will be used to endow the Eleanor Tamarind Whitmore Foundation, which will operate in perpetuity to support women who have been overlooked or marginalized by their families. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $40 million. The true scope of my inheritance, the fortune that had been sitting quietly in trust accounts while my family made plans for my future, based on the assumption that I was financially dependent on their goodwill. Charles stood up abruptly, the letter crumpling in his hands. This is impossible. You don't have $40 million. You can't have had access to that kind of money without us knowing. Actually, I said, standing to face him, I can and I did. The Tamarind Trust was established by my father specifically to ensure my independence. You never knew about it because you never asked about my family's financial history. You assumed that marrying your father made me financially dependent on him and eventually on you. Stephanie found her voice, though it was shaky. Eleanor, this is clearly a mistake. You're not competent to make these kinds of decisions. Just last week you were talking about assisted living. Last week, I replied, you were talking about assisted living. I was listening to you attempt to manipulate me into signing away my independence. There's a difference. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at me with new understanding. Grandma, are you saying that you've been wealthy this whole time? I'm saying that I've been independent this whole time. I just forgot that for a while. As the family filed out, Charles still clutching his unread letter, I felt the satisfaction of a lesson well taught. My fortune would live on through the foundation, supporting women who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or diminished by their families. My granddaughter would have the resources to pursue her dreams without compromise, and my son would have the opportunity to learn the difference between entitlement and inheritance. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is the gift of your own. The phone started ringing before I'd finished my morning coffee. News of the will reading had spread through Charleston's social networks with the speed of a summer storm, and suddenly everyone wanted to remember their friendship with Eleanor Whitmore. But the call that mattered most came from Katie Morrison, a reporter at the Charleston City paper, who'd been following my foundation's activities. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to do a feature story about your philanthropic work. I think our readers would be interested in learning about your background and your goals for the foundation." I agreed to the interview, understanding that publicity would serve my purposes better than privacy. We met at my house on Trad Street, where Katie admired the portrait of my father that hung in the front hall and the shelves of books that documented my academic career. "Tell me about your decision to establish the foundation," she said, settling into Edward's old chair with her notebook. I chose my words carefully, knowing that this story would be read by everyone who'd written me off as a confused old woman. I realized that my own experience of being overlooked and marginalized wasn't unique. There are many women my age who've been made invisible by their families, their communities, even by themselves. I wanted to create something that would support their efforts to reclaim their voices. "You say you were overlooked. Can you elaborate on that?" I described the gradual erosion of my independence, the way I'd been systematically excluded from decisions about my own life, the assumption that being a widow automatically made me incompetent. I talked about the assisted living brochures that had appeared without my request, the medical appointments that had been made without my knowledge, the social activities that had been cancelled on my behalf. "It sounds like you were experiencing a form of elder abuse," Katie said. I considered the term. I think it was more complicated than that. I think it was a form of erasure. I was being erased from my own life, one decision at a time, until I became a character in someone else's story, rather than the author of my own. The article ran the following week, under the headline, "The Woman Charleston Forgot, Eleanor Whitmore's Fight for Visibility." Katie had woven together my personal story with statistics about elder isolation and family financial abuse, creating a narrative that resonated far beyond Charleston's borders. The response was overwhelming. I received letters from women across the South who'd experienced similar treatment from their families. Some had been moved to assisted living facilities against their will. Others had been stripped of their financial independence by adult children who claimed to be acting in their best interests. Many had simply been forgotten, their opinions dismissed, and their contributions overlooked. But the most powerful response came from Charleston itself. The city seemed to wake up to the realization that it had indeed forgotten Eleanor Whitmore. Invitations poured in from organizations that had quietly dropped me from their membership rolls. Former colleagues reached out to apologize for their absence during Edward's illness. Friends who'd been told I was too fragile for social contact suddenly remembered their affection for me. The Charleston Historical Society not only restored my membership, but asked me to chair their new committee on women's contributions to local history. The College of Charleston invited me to deliver a lecture on the invisible women of Southern literature. 3 different nonprofit boards begged me to consider serving as their president. I was suddenly visible again, but this time on my own terms. The most satisfying vindication came from an unexpected source. Margaret Pemberton, who'd patronized me at Edward's funeral, called to invite me to a dinner party she was hosting for Charleston's most influential women. "Eleanor, I feel terrible that I didn't realize how active you were in the community," she said. "I'd love to introduce you to some of the younger philanthropists who are doing such innovative work." I accepted the invitation, understanding that Margaret's dinner party would be attended by exactly the people who'd dismissed me as irrelevant just months earlier. It would be an opportunity to demonstrate the difference between being seen and being understood. The evening was everything I'd expected. Charleston's social elite gathered in Margaret's historic mansion, drinking wine and discussing their various charitable endeavors. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a dress I'd purchased for the occasion, expensive, elegant, and designed to remind everyone that I was no longer someone's dependent. The conversations were revealing. Several women approached me with stories about their own aging mothers, their concerns about elder care, their struggles with family dynamics. They spoke as if these were universal challenges, rather than specific consequences of how families chose to treat their older members. "It's so difficult," one woman confided. "My mother is becoming increasingly difficult to manage. She refuses to consider assisted living, even though she's clearly not capable of making sound decisions anymore." I listened with the patience I'd developed through decades of teaching, waiting for the right moment to offer perspective. "Have you considered that she might be resisting because she's afraid of losing her independence? Sometimes what looks like confusion or stubbornness is actually a rational response to feeling powerless." The woman looked startled. "I never thought about it that way. But she's so isolated, so withdrawn from her normal activities." "Who decided she should withdraw from those activities?" I asked gently. "Did she choose to step back, or was she encouraged to do so by family members who thought they were protecting her?" I could see the moment of recognition in her eyes, the uncomfortable realization that her mother's isolation might have been imposed rather than chosen. These conversations continued throughout the evening. I found myself serving as an informal counselor, helping other women understand that their aging relatives might be experiencing forced invisibility rather than natural decline. I shared stories from my foundation's work, examples of women who'd reclaimed their voices and their power when given the support to do so. By the end of the night, I'd received 3 offers to serve on non-profit boards, 2 invitations to speak at conferences, and 1 request to mentor a young woman starting her own foundation. I was no longer the woman Charleston had forgotten. I was the woman Charleston couldn't ignore. As I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow whose own family considered her incompetent. Now I was a philanthropist whose opinions were sought and valued. The only difference was that I'd stopped accepting other people's definitions of my worth. I'd remembered that being forgotten was a choice, not a fate. And I'd chosen to be. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation's first annual gala was scheduled for March, exactly 6 months after Edward's funeral. As I stood in the ballroom of the Francis Marion Hotel, watching Lydia and her team transform the space into a celebration of women's resilience, I felt the satisfaction of a life reclaimed. The guest list read like a who's who of Charleston society, but with a difference. These weren't just the usual suspects from the social register. We'd invited women who'd been overlooked, dismissed or forgotten by their families and communities, retired teachers who'd been pressured to step down from volunteer positions, widows who'd been isolated by well-meaning children, older women who'd been written off as irrelevant to contemporary discussions about their own lives. "Mrs. Whitmore," said Dr. Maria Santos, the Foundation's first scholarship recipient, "I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. Being able to return to graduate school at 62 has given me back my sense of purpose." Maria had been a high school Spanish teacher for 30 years before her daughter convinced her to retire and move in with her family. "For your own good," the daughter had explained. "You're getting too old to handle classroom management." Maria had spent 2 miserable years as a live-in babysitter before learning about our foundation's educational grants for women over 60. "How are your studies going?" I asked. "Wonderfully. I'm pursuing my master's in library science. I want to work in community outreach, helping other Spanish-speaking women access educational resources." She paused, her eyes bright with tears. "For the first time in years, I feel like myself again." That phrase, "I feel like myself again," had become the Foundation's unofficial motto. It appeared in nearly every letter we received from grant recipients, scholarship winners, and program participants. Women who'd been convinced they were past their prime, beyond their usefulness, beyond their relevance, were rediscovering their own voices. The gala's keynote speaker was Dr. Rebecca Williams, a 73-year-old former medical school dean who'd been forced into early retirement by a university that wanted to refresh its leadership. She'd used her foundation grant to establish a mentorship program for older women in medicine, pairing experienced physicians with younger colleagues who were facing age discrimination. "Eleanor Whitmore has created something revolutionary," Rebecca told the audience. "She's created a space where being older doesn't mean being less than, where having lived experience is valued rather than dismissed, where women like us can continue to contribute rather than simply consume." I watched the faces in the audience, some surprised, some moved, all forced to confront their own assumptions about aging and relevance. In the back of the room, I spotted Charles and Stephanie, who'd received invitations along with everyone else on Charleston's social circuit. They'd dressed appropriately for the occasion, but their discomfort was palpable. Sarah sat at the head table with me, having taken a leave of absence from her marketing job to work with the foundation. At 23, she brought energy and digital marketing expertise that complemented my experience and resources. More importantly, she brought a perspective that helped bridge the gap between generations. "Grandma," she said, during a quiet moment between speeches, "I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about what happened with Dad and Stephanie, about the way they treated you." I turned to give her my full attention. "What about it?" "I should have said something sooner. I should have stood up for you when they were making all those decisions about your life. I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid to challenge them." I took her hand, feeling the weight of her regret. "Sarah, you were 22 years old. You weren't responsible for managing your father's behavior or protecting me from his choices. That was my job, and I failed to do it for far too long. But you're doing it now," she said. "You're not just standing up for yourself, you're standing up for women everywhere who are being treated the way you were. That's incredible." The gala raised over $2 million for the foundation's programs, but more importantly, it established the foundation as a serious player in Charleston's philanthropic landscape. We were no longer an interesting novelty. We were an institution with staying power and serious resources. In the weeks following the gala, I began working on my memoir. The idea had come from Katie Morrison, the reporter who'd written the City paper article. "You need to tell your full story," she'd said. "Not just the foundation work, but the whole journey from invisibility to empowerment." I'd titled the book The Quietest Room, after a line from a Virginia Woolf essay about the spaces women occupy in their own lives. The writing process was both therapeutic and illuminating, forcing me to examine not just what had happened to me, but how I'd allowed it to happen. The most difficult chapter to write was about my relationship with Charles. I'd spent months angry at him for his treatment of me, but as I worked through the narrative, I began to understand that he'd been as trapped by societal expectations as I had been. He'd been taught that taking care of aging parents meant taking control of their lives, that love was expressed through management rather than respect. That understanding didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped me see a path toward eventual reconciliation. The letter I'd left for him at the will reading had been harsh, focused on punishment rather than possibility. But my memoir could be different. It could be an invitation to understand rather than a condemnation of his choices. The manuscript was nearly complete when I received an unexpected visitor. Michael, my younger grandson, appeared at my door on a Thursday afternoon, still wearing his Clemson University sweatshirt and carrying a backpack full of business textbooks. "Grandma," he said, "I need to talk to you about something important." We sat in my living room, where the afternoon light caught the crystal stemware I'd left to Stephanie, a reminder of the choices we all make about what we value and what we dismiss. "I've been thinking about the foundation," Michael said, "about what you're doing with your life. I want to help." I studied his face, seeing both his father's practical nature and something else, a moral clarity that gave me hope for the future. "I want to learn the business side of what you're doing. I want to understand how to make philanthropy sustainable and effective. I want to be part of carrying on your legacy." Legacy. The word hung in the air between us, full of possibility and promise. I was 87 years old, and for the first time in decades, I felt confident about the future I was leaving. 4 years after Edward's funeral, I celebrated my 91st birthday, not with a party that no one attended, but with a celebration that had to be moved to a larger venue, twice to accommodate all the people who wanted to honor my life. The College of Charleston's Alumni Hall was packed with foundation grant recipients, community leaders, former students, and family members who'd learnt to see me not as a burden to be managed, but as a woman whose contributions continued to matter. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented the community I'd built over 4 years of reclaiming my voice. Maria Santos sat in the front row, now the head librarian at Charleston's main branch, having transformed their Spanish-language outreach programs. Dr. Rebecca Williams had flown in from Atlanta, where she was consulting with medical schools about age discrimination policies. Sarah sat with Michael, both of them now full-time employees of the foundation, carrying forward the work with energy and commitment that assured me of its continuation. Even Charles and Stephanie were there, seated toward the back but present nonetheless. We'd achieved a careful détente over the years, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Charles had read my memoir when it was published, and we'd had several difficult but necessary conversations about the assumptions he'd made about my capabilities and needs. Stephanie had taken longer to come around, but she'd eventually acknowledged that her attempts to manage my life had been misguided. When I turned 87, I told the audience, I thought my life was essentially over. I'd been widowed, marginalized, and made to feel irrelevant to my own family's story. I was preparing to disappear quietly into the kind of institutional invisibility that society reserves for older women. I paused, looking around the room at the faces of women who'd found their own voices through the Foundation's programs. Instead, I discovered that being forgotten is a choice, not a fate, and I chose to remember myself. The applause was warm and sustained, but I wasn't finished. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation has now distributed over $30 million in grants, scholarships and program funding. We've helped 2,847 women reclaim their voices, their independence, and their sense of purpose. But more importantly, we've helped them remember that their stories aren't over just because someone else stopped listening. After the formal celebration, I found myself in my garden at home, surrounded by the roses Edward and I had planted during our early years in the house. Sarah and Michael were helping clean up, their laughter carrying across the evening air as they worked together to pack up the leftover flowers and food. "Grandma," Sarah said, joining me on the garden bench, "I have something to tell you. Michael and I have been talking, and we want to expand the Foundation's work. We're thinking about establishing satellite offices in other cities, maybe even other states." I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a legacy well planned. "That sounds ambitious. Do you have the resources to support that kind of expansion?" Michael approached, his business degree evident in the spreadsheets he was carrying. "We've run the numbers. The Foundation's endowment has grown significantly over the past 4 years. We have enough resources to support expansion while maintaining our current programs." I studied their faces, seeing the passion and commitment that would carry this work forward long after I was gone. "What would you need from me?" "Your blessing," Sarah said simply. "And maybe your help in identifying other cities where women might benefit from what we're doing." We spent the next hour discussing their plans, their vision for expanding the Foundation's reach and impact. I found myself thinking about my father, about his foresight in establishing the Tamarind Trust, about his understanding that resources meant nothing without the wisdom to use them well. As the evening wound down and my family prepared to leave, I felt a deep sense of completion, not ending, but fulfillment. I'd taken the $50 million my father had left me and transformed it into something that would continue to make a difference long after I was gone. I'd taken my own experience of marginalization and invisibility and turned it into a platform for helping others reclaim their power. Most importantly, I'd remembered that being 87 didn't mean being irrelevant. It meant being wise enough to know the difference between being loved and being managed, between being respected and being patronized, between being seen and being truly understood. 2 years later, I passed away peacefully in my sleep, surrounded by the people who'd learnt to see me not as someone's burden, but as someone's inspiration. My memoir, The Quietest Room, had become a bestseller, inspiring women across the country to examine their own relationships with family members who might be systematically erasing them from their own lives. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation had grown into a national organization with offices in 12 cities, having helped over 10,000 women reclaim their voices and their power. Sarah had become its president, while Michael managed its financial operations with the same careful attention to detail that had made my father's shipping business successful. But perhaps the most meaningful part of my legacy was the change I'd witnessed in my own family. Charles had become an advocate for elder rights, using his legal expertise to help other families navigate the complexities of aging without sacrificing autonomy. Stephanie had started a consulting business, helping families create care plans that honored their elders' independence rather than superseding it. My final gift to them was a letter I'd asked James Dalrymple to deliver after my death. It wasn't a condemnation or a continuation of our conflicts, but a simple acknowledgement of growth and forgiveness. "We all make mistakes," I'd written. "The question is whether we learn from them. You've learned, and I'm proud of the people you've become." The woman who'd been ignored at her husband's funeral had become the woman Charleston couldn't forget. The widow who'd been scheduled for assisted living had become the philanthropist whose foundation would continue her work for generations. The mother who'd been dismissed as confused had become the matriarch whose wisdom guided her family toward better ways of loving each other. I'd learnt that being forgotten is indeed a choice, not a fate. And I'd chosen to be remembered not as someone's wife or mother or burden, but as Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who'd used her final years to prove that age is not the end of influence, but the beginning of a different kind of power. The power to change not just your own story, but the stories of everyone who comes